Hi everyone. Thanks everyone again for joining the this office hours. What's the date? The 7th of June already. A couple of small updates on the Academy. We've had our first external project in terms of the open printing organization create an issue, and we're working with them to try and streamline the process of working with external projects. We still have an issue with we're still trying to link projects between repositories, and we still have some work to do there. Another thing that's come up that I was going to mention is the CLA, which is something you typically need to sign when working with documentation that Canonical is then going to use for its products. And we've had it's been a bit tricky making this an automated process, but we found out today that there's been some work done just this week to try and help that happen more easily. I mean, people have signed the CLA and then gone and created like a pull request on a repository, for example, that then uses an action to check if you've signed the CLA. It's been breaking, and and it's been very frustrating for everyone involved. So we're hopeful that there's going to be a solution to that within the next couple of weeks. It was actually a manual process of adding each person to the database, or probably a spreadsheet, let's be honest, that managed all those people. So hopefully that'll get easier in the next couple of weeks. We've also got a schedule for today, and Robert has very bravely offered to, maybe not bravely, brave is the wrong word, but Robert's offered to talk about docs as code for today's office hours. So I'm going to hand it over to Robert.
So hello everyone, let me start by sharing my screen. Hopefully this is going to work.
I think bravely was the right word, considering you're using Wayland.
Yeah, let me just know if it stops flicking.
Yeah, it looks good. It looks good, Robert.
All right, and then now for the actual slideshow. Oh, crap. Oh. All right, hello everyone. So, flickering is back on.
If you want to, you could send me the link, and I could try and share it if you're worried about this. It is flickering.
Stop. Yeah, I was gonna share the link anyway.
Seems okay now.
Okay, well, feel free to follow along anyway. So for today, I wanted to pick one of the subjects that Graham actually came up with, and that is documentation as code. And this is going to be just a really very general introduction into the topic, and I'm going to do some comparison. I'm going to highlight some of the main aspects or features of this approach. And then I'm going to talk about some of the advantages, as well as some of the problematic or potential challenging aspects that this approach brings with itself. So let me get started. So what are we going to be talking about? First, I'm going to quickly go over what it actually means. What does it mean when somebody sends documentation as code, and what it involves. Then I'm going to go over some of the benefits, why somebody would want to consider an approach like that, what the benefits are for the authors of the documentation, as well as for developers of software projects. That this is mainly targeted at documentation that covers software applications, as well as for projects, be it open source projects or be it organizations or even companies. And then I'm going to briefly talk about some of the challenges, both again for the writers of the documentation as well as for the developers, and some of the technical problems that it may bring along. And then if anybody would be interested, I've got some prompts for a discussion about this. If anybody will want to share their experience or talk about some of the stuff that has been discussed in in the presentation. So what does it mean? What is documentation as code? So I tried to put together a very generic description here, and that, but what it comes down to is really treating documentation as software code, as the source code that is being used to build applications. And there are some specifics to that, and of course I want to highlight that this something as code, it's not limited to documentation. Then when it's being discussed, then the code is meant in in a distributed, non-centralized version control system. Of course, there are other ways of developing code, but this S code moniker really only applies to the so-called open or open source development model that is being mostly these days done through Git. So there are some aspects of it, or some goals, if you will, that you really need to look at if you want to publish or author, maintain, and publish some documentation. And I try to align them here with what the tooling would look like, because probably the main difference in documentation as code, as opposed to some quote unquote traditional approaches to publishing documentation, is that just like with code development and the entire code lifecycle, it comes down to not using one monolithic system for the entire endeavor, but using specific tooling for individual steps of the entire journey. So the documentation as code, it may or may not mean that the documentation or the sources for the documentation are developed and maintained alongside the code, alongside the source code for the software project. It may mean that, it may not mean that, but what is common to both of those approaches is the use of specialized tooling for the individual steps. So for content authoring, it's very simple. What is used is regular text markup. So that means that it's not in some sort of a binary format, and therefore text editors of anyone's choice can be used. For formatting and styling of the documentation, the advantage, also for some people a challenge of using an approach like that, is that markup languages are used, and that means that the formatting and styling is based on semanticity, as opposed to formatting that is being applied directly to the content. What that means is that there is some sort of a style or style sheet that is applied to the markup language, and when that is rendered, then based on what the interpretation of that style sheet is, the documentation, the content gets gets styled, gets formatted. So that means that this can differ, and it also means that the same sources can be easily used for producing different output formats, such as for the web, HTML, or for other things such as EPUBs or PDFs and so on. Another thing is version control. Documentation, of course, usually needs to be versioned. In this case, it means that a version control system, such as the ubiquitous Git, is used. Issue tracking, meaning where issues with the documentation, either for planning purposes or for bug fixing purposes, again, a specialized tool is usually at play, and that you can have your pick. Jira, Bugzilla, others are also available. Testing and validation of the documentation, again, specialized tooling is used, and it can be different for each project, but again, it borrows heavily from the way testing and validation is done for software source code. One can even speak of unit tests to a degree, because when scripts or linters are utilized, then it comes if it's done right, then unit tests would be provided so that the content can be easily checked, and those tests are reusable. They're not limited to a single run for a particular piece of content. And finally, publishing. This is being done through usually static site builders for hosting when it's on the internet, then HTML content, or through some content management system into which the outcome of the content authoring and all of those steps before is fed. So that's basically the life cycle of documentation when it's being maintained as code. It's very similar to, as I said, the code of the source code of programs, and that's the intention. And with that, I'm going to switch to the next slide, because I'm going to be talking about those benefits which that intention inherently brings with it. So one of the main advantages is that the developers who would be either using the documentation or for whose project or for whose software that documentation is developed are already familiar with the toolchain. They're going to be familiar with Git. They're going to be familiar with scripting tooling or other tooling. They're going to be familiar with text editors or IDEs that are being used to develop the source code of the documentation. And that means that developers are going to be much more comfortable contributing to the documentation, and the documentation is going to be much closer to the project. So it's going to be simpler for documentation people to sort of prevail upon developers to treat documentation seriously and to consider it an inherent part of the project. Also, because developers are already going to be familiar with the workflow, contributions from their side are going to be easier, and they're going to invite, this setup is going to invite one-off contributions. A person does not need to be a part of the documentation team or of the entire project. If they see a simple thing that can be fixed, they can do it just like they would with code. And another thing that has already been sort of alluded to is that the documentation would be much better integrated with the entire development. So when it's being treated like that, it can easily be a part of the product planning, and it can be included in the so-called definition of done, meaning that when it's not removed away from the software source code, the existence or the validation of documentation for a piece of code can be included in a workflow that is normally reserved or only for the functionality. Also, if there is such a thing as a QA team, then they can be involved with the validation of the documentation. So what it all means is that the entire software project is going to have a much more aligned sense of responsibility for the whole thing, and documentation is going to be a part of it that is not going to feel as an afterthought. Now, when it comes to the projects themselves, or when the sort of organizations that might be responsible for the source code of both the software and the documentation, one major advantage is that when open tooling and when tooling such as that is being used for the open source development model is also utilized for documentation, then there's no danger of the so-called vendor lock-in. That means that if an organization would be using a proprietary tool such as, you might be familiar with Adobe FrameMaker or MatCAD Flare or tools like that, or RoboHelp, that are very popular in documentation teams. But all of these tools, to a degree, tie the organization to that particular tool. And if the tool, for example, would no longer be in favor in that organization, or if that tool would have reliability problems, or if that tool would go out of business, then the organization, of course, is stuck with documentation that would be difficult to maintain without that particular tool. If documentation is just based on simple text, markup languages, and maintained using version control system and text editors, nothing like that is in danger of happening. So there's a great deal of flexibility. Even the migration between, for example, different markup formats gets much easier when it's like this. And what is also good is, if it's an organization that is larger, then adopting a workflow like that can eliminate lots of overhead and lots of sort of reinventing the wheel and duplication. The processes can be aligned with the releases of the software much easier. Refer to the definition of done, and things like automation can be employed across the board, meaning that if one team is developing documentation and a software source code in one way, then the same can be applied across the board, across the entire organization, or all other projects, or at least that is the idea. Now, about some of the challenges. Of course, if an organization or if a project already has a workflow that is established, and it may have some drawbacks, but it already works and it's been used that way, then there might be some resistance. And if people are not familiar with the tool chain, or they feel that the learning curve might be very steep for them, if they've been using some integrated monolithic solution for documentation, then transitioning to a text editor and tooling for validation and tooling for publishing, that is all very different. That can be a problem, because of course, change for the sake of change is never good, but people may feel that the advantages outweigh, do not outweigh the disadvantages, and that means relearning. I would not say so, but it's definitely a consideration that needs to be taken into account. And of course, from the developers, there might be some resistance as well, because if, for example, you include documentation in the definition of done, or in make it an inherent part of the project, then many developers may feel that they are being slowed down by the inclusion of that. The development may not be as agile as they would want. And of course, if developers have been used to contributing or creating documentation just for themselves, then the more exposure, the visibility may not be to everyone's liking. And then finally, there are some technical considerations. For example, if you already have documentation in some format, then the conversion to plain text format, a markup language, might not be trivial. And if it's an organization or a company that is on a tight schedule, which usually happens, then one needs to consider potential release disruption if a documentation or any part of the entire process is being changed. But again, that's a consideration. I would not say that it outweighs the benefits that have been mentioned before, but it's something that should be taken into account. So yeah, and that's my 101. That's the introduction. But I have here a page of prompts for a potential discussion. If anyone has ever gone through such a conversion or migration, I'd be interested to hear. I'd be also interested in hearing what kind of tooling people might be familiar with or might be partial to, and so forth. So yeah, I hope this was useful to people who may not be familiar with the entire approach, and let's talk about it if you're interested.
I don't know if you want to field the questions yourself, Robert, but Artem had his hand up.
Oh yeah, please, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, well, this really nice introduction. This is a really interesting topic because it's, I mean, it's quite popular, and everybody is talking about this, but quite superficial. And but we have an opportunity here to talk about some finer aspects of this. One thing I wanted to mention is that Dox's code is really good because it enables the review to run in the same environment that the developers use. And given the fact that the developers are usually at least somehow involved in this process, this is really useful because you can use GitHub, GitLab, Reviewbot, the same tool that they use for code reviews, and they don't have to learn a new tool or maybe suffer through Google Sheets or Google Docs or I don't know, SharePoint or whatever, Confluence. Second aspect is that having your docs near or in the same repo as your code greatly simplifies change tracking, notifications, and integrations, all kinds of that stuff. But that has a shadow aspect I will maybe mention later. Something of a mixed, maybe an advantage slash disadvantage is the fact that this approach somehow ties the documentation to the development cycles. It makes it really easy to start depending on release cadence and so on and so forth because it affects the repo, for example, and you will need inevitably to follow the same code freezes and stuff like that. Some of the negative aspects are that switching between markup dialects is really hard. This is something I found especially problematic because you can switch an editor, you can switch your CBS or VCS, or but switching from restructured text to Markdown or from one dialect of Markdown to another is a lot of work. And speaking about Markdown, you will find yourself spending more time on formatting your sources, on figuring out how to approach this formatting issue, this markup issue, or that one. Well, you will definitely spend a lot of time on that. So you will probably need a style guide for that as well. And speaking about tooling, specifically text editors, you will also need a tool that is equally, or at least equally not abysmally bad at helping you write your wonderful texts and dealing with markups, markup issues, build, integration, source control, all kinds of stuff. And unless you are a really seasoned keyboard jockey, this is not an easy task to solve immediately. I mean, but usually, oh, well, people already have opinions about that in the chat, I see, as I can see. That's what I wanted to add. So, thank you.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to add something. I think I like the idea of Doctor's code a lot, and thanks, Robert, for the presentation. I don't think it always fits, and there's a bit of it sometimes sounds cooler than it really is in practice, but there's one element of Doctor's code that I think is unbeatable, and that's attaching documentation to branches of software development, so that you typically you have like the main branch of a piece of software, and everybody's kind of working towards the next release, and the documentation inside that branch can be developed at the same time. And then when you cut a release and you release 1.0, you may create a 1.0 branch, and at that point you can cut the documentation at the 1.0 branch, and it'll remain in there as it was at the 1.0, and you can also maintain it as you would the software for bug fixes and security fixes and the 1.1 releases and the 1.2 releases. But then of course the main will continue working towards a 2 release, and the documentation can do that as well. And I don't know of any other way other than treating docs as code of doing that. So I think that's another powerful reason for it. I think I don't know. Do you want to respond to my? I know that. Yeah.
No, you're right. I didn't really want to go into details during the presentation because I thought that was already too long. But you're basically, even if it's not Git that is being used as the version control system, the proximity to code is great, and it doesn't even have to be the same repo, as long as there is the understanding that the development is done side by side. Then I think that's a great advantage. And the one thing that sort of ties it together is the use of the same tooling for both the source code of the docs and the source code of the software, and so that there is not a barrier where one would not be visible to the other. But yeah, Bill, Ruth, go ahead.
I think my big takeaways are: number one, use a format that is portable, whether that's plain text or Markdown or something common that can be used in many different editors and many different systems, displayed by many different systems. Use the editor that is most comfortable for you, where you've developed muscle memory, where you've developed a workflow and a rhythm, and keep it in some sort of common version control system where you can both control the versions and manage the inputs from other people so that you can control changes. If you do those three things, I think you've met most of the requirements of Docs as code, but you can refute that if you want.
No, I think that especially with the text editor, one of the greatest advantages is that it's anyone's choice. You can work with a team or with a group of other people on the same documentation, and everyone can be using their tool of choice, which when usually not that it would be an all-encompassing rule, but usually when you're not using an approach like that, then you're tied to a specific tool, and you cannot really do anything about that. Yeah, Ruth, you were next, I believe.
Yeah, I think what is also an important aspect to consider when you try to decide whether you want to go for Docs as code or not is also a bit the responsibility in the team, and also, of course, the type of documentation. Because Docs as code is great if you have like a collaborative documentation. So developers contribute to the documentation, which I think for most software projects is the way that most teams will do it. But there can also be other documentation where the responsibility really lies with the technical writer. So if I'm thinking about maybe specs or more like any kind of regulatory documents, where it needs to be clear how they are edited, and or even marketing content maybe that needs to look in a certain way, where it's going to be the technical writer in the end who is responsible for creating those documents. And there you might not want to go for a docs as code approach, but you collect the input and then the technical writer creates the documentation. While in docs as code is perfect for anything where you want to collaborate and have the developers involved in the documentation.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the perspective. And Nick?
Yeah, I think most of the things I wanted to say have already been covered, but specifically when Graham was mentioning being able to branch stuff and tie documentation to branches, that is another aspect of that is automation, which is when you're automatically generating even parts of your documentation, and it's invaluable to be able to do it in the repo with the code. I could certainly, I'm not going to name names, but I know of one major software project where we worked out that we'd shipped the wrong thing because the documentation looked wrong. And it looked wrong because it was being generated automatically and some of the bits of the software were wrong. So not how it's supposed to work, but it turned out to be really useful in that case. And I guess hand in hand with that, testing is also much easier when you have the docs inside the repo with the code. That was it.
Yep. Very true. Artem.
Yeah. Well, one other aspect that was briefly touched upon earlier is change tracking, because with most text processing systems that don't involve the docs as code approach, it can be pretty rudimentary. But with docs as code, you get all the power of version control at your fingertips, and you can easily navigate between all kinds of changes, find out who did what, why they did what, and stuff like that. Also, docs as code can be extended further into two aspects, one of which Nick mentioned here. Specifically, it greatly simplifies testing just because everything is in one place. It can be automated. You can reuse all kinds of stuff from your code, like, for example, export your API definitions. You can export your console commands, console help, and turn it into live documentation, which will always stay more or less relevant instead of going stale immediately. And one thing that is notoriously hard to address with docs as code is pictures, which are sometimes involved in documentation. And there's also a solution for that, which is neatly called diagrams as code. It may not suit all the purposes, but at least the approach is developing, and it exists, first of all.
Right. And Graham.
Yes, just I actually wanted to ask you, Robert, what are your, maybe it's a bit unfair, but what are your feelings? Do you think it's a good general approach? Have you had success with it in the past? Is it kind of a default approach you'd take?
For me, it would. I have not really been involved in a very specific situation, such as what Ruth mentioned, but I would probably default to that, even if the circumstances were such that Ruth was describing, because that's what I'm familiar with. But what I really like about it, apart from the fact that I believe that docs as code is inherently much more transparent and seamless than other approaches. But I really like it because it's the possibilities are much broader, I would think, for dealing with regular things. It starts with your choice of text editor, which is really trivial and at the end of the day not that important. But when it comes to automation and parsing and linting and maintaining the entire code base, and by code base I mean the source code for the documentation, then I think that the possibilities are pretty much limitless. Anything can be developed, anything can be adopted from other places and so forth. Whereas if you have documentation in some monolithic system, then your possibilities are limited by that system. And unless the company or the creator of that system adds some functionality to it, then it's not there. Yeah, I really like the, for want of a better word, freedom that it affords. It's possibly a little bit more complicated or not as easy for someone who's not familiar with that or who's not familiar with software development. But yeah, I think that this flexibility, the sort of built-in potential of it just is unbeatable.
Thank you. If there are no more questions for Robert, thank you once again, Robert, for putting all that together. It was really interesting. I'm sure we could revisit this. There's a load more things I want to ask, but yeah, it's a really good subject. We're getting, if you haven't seen it, we now have a documentation office hours schedule on the forum where we're trying to plan ahead the subjects that we're going to discuss in the documentation office hours. And this time next week, Nick is going to be talking about Veil. So take a look if those things interested you, and we'll do that next week. I'm going to stop the recording now and give anyone who may want to an opportunity to ask questions, any questions they want, but about the Academy or about documentation in general. Okay, thanks again, Robert.